Hi, I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream. Today, an unprecedented data leak names celebrities, politicians, and even well-known criminals in a complicated web of how the rich hide their wealth. But what does that mean for you? Stay tuned, you may be surprised. The Panama Papers, as they're called, have created quite a stir online, and I know because you've been tweeting me all week. Omar Madar, what are you seeing, digital producer?
That's right, Malika. This topic has been quite a topic of conversation for our online community. You know, we've received many pitches to cover the Panama Papers throughout the week, and the reaction to the leaks has been quite varied. For example, we have Michael over here, who says that he thinks it's okay for wealthy Americans to try to protect their money from the U.S. government, which takes it and spends it recklessly. While over here in Iceland, as you can see on my screen, we have this tweet from a couple of days ago with a video of the protests that were taking place. Thousands of people took to the streets in protest of their prime minister, who was implicated in the revelations. Now, we'll get further into these responses during our show, but in the meantime, you can join this conversation by tweeting us using AJ Stream.
Approximately $20 trillion is said to be hidden in offshore banks around the world. The International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, or ICIJ, this weekend went public with its findings that the firm Mossack Fonseca allegedly helped clients evade or avoid tax, launder money, or mask its origins. The firm has issued a statement denying involvement with many of the parties named, denying legal wrongdoing, and it says it's worked in compliance with protocols and regulations. The millions of documents leaked span dozens of countries and name thousands. In Iceland's capital, Reykjavik, citizens took to the streets after hearing their prime minister and his wife are alleged to be involved with a shell company. Facing political pressure, he stepped aside on Tuesday. In Iceland, we've seen a direct impact of the leak, but in other nations, it's still reverberating. So what does that mean for you? The ICIJ explains how behind the emails and bank statements are real victims.
In Uganda, a company that wanted to sell a prospective oil field paid Mossack Fonseca to help it avoid $400 million in taxes. It was simple paperwork. The company's address was changed from one tax haven to another. In a country where 1 in 3 people live on less than $1.25 a day, $400 million represents more than the government's annual health budget. Uganda spent years in court trying to force the company to pay its taxes. Meanwhile, hospitals in the shadow of the oil field lacked funds for even the most basic equipment. Patients slept on floors. They were asked to bring their own medical supplies, like sterile gloves and cotton balls.
It's a global story that might be closer to your home than you think. To help us break things down, we're joined on set today by Mark Hayes. He's Senior Advisor on Money Laundering at Global Witness. Will Fitzgibbon is a reporter with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. Steve Topple is a freelance journalist in the UK. And Kelso is Advocacy Director at Transparency International. Thank you all for being here. Mark, I want to start with you. Who's actually harmed, if anyone, if a bunch of billionaires decide they're not going to pay as much tax as the rest of us think they should?
That's a great question. You know, at the risk of being simplistic, all of us, in all of our research into the role of shell companies in crime, corruption, and conflict around the world, you know, we've seen that these issues are impacting people at a local and a global scale. You know, just to give an example, there's a major case breaking in Nigeria right now where a major oil company may have colluded with the government there to siphon off $1.1 billion in oil revenues from a deal that should have gone to Nigerian Treasury. But on a much more local scale, there are examples we know about in the U.S. where shell companies were used to finance human trafficking rings that operated in 14 different states, as well as other crimes. So whether you know it or not, there could be a shell company operating next door to you, financing some scheme that you know nothing about, but impacts the people around you today.
Wow, whether we know it or not. So Will, you are at the heart of this in some way because you're with the consortium. What do you think the real world impacts are?
I think the real world impacts, as Mark said, touch every country, and I think thanks to Panama Papers now we know a lot more than people ever hoped that we would. You know, I remember when I first started with Panama Papers, reading through some of the files.
When was that? When did you first start?
We started in the middle of last year, about May last year. You know, and you can quite literally read an email from someone who writes asking to set up a shell company because they think that the country they live in has too high a tax rate.
Did they put it that bluntly? Is it that clear in the emails?
Yeah, I remember I tweeted a few days ago, one American resident wrote in saying, just before Barack Obama was sworn in January 2009, I want to incorporate an offshore company because I don't want to pay the tax rate that Barack Obama is going to impose on me.
Wow.
And you know, Malika, we have people who are outraged about the implications this has on society. We have Hadim over here who tweeted in saying, the U.S. is the richest country on earth, and we're talking about the feasibility of providing health care. Goes on to say, a tax haven is inequality par excellence, unequal access to a law-dodging resource. Casey, I want to toss this to you, the unequal access part. Basically, who typically tries to set up these offshore accounts, and what does it take to actually set one up?
It doesn't take that much at all. We've tested it out ourselves, and it takes a relatively short period of time, maybe 24 hours. If you want to pay a higher fee, you can be quicker than that. In Delaware, they have an expedited service if you pay it just a bit more. So it is open to anyone to incorporate these shell companies. It's the rich, though, that use them to move large amounts of money through them in bank accounts offshore.
So, Steve, you heard what Casey said. What do you make then of the argument that it is the wealthy, the rich, who are moving their money offshore? Those lost taxes that the rest of the citizens could be benefiting from, they're not being able to benefit. They could be going to education, they could be going to infrastructure, fixing roads and bridges that are in need of it. What do you make of that argument to say that's where this money should have gone? Is that true?
I think that's probably the most pertinent argument we have. This needs to be looked at as a global problem. Currently, where I am in the UK, we're viewing it very much as from an OECD perspective. If you take somewhere like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, they lost $1.3 billion out of 5 mining deals which were placed offshore. $1.3 billion is small change to us in the West. However, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, that's a huge amount of money. And viewed through the prism of it as a global issue, it creeps into everyone's life.
Marcus, are you nodding there?
Yeah, the case that was just mentioned I'm familiar with, and there's another case it reminds me of, which is the case of Théodore Obiang, who is the son of the President for Life of Equatorial Guinea, a small country that a lot of people in the States or elsewhere might not know about. It's resource rich with timber and oil, but it's one of the poorest countries in the world. But unfortunately, Théodore Obiang was the subject of a major law enforcement case over the last decade or more, where he siphoned off tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars from his state's coffers and used them to buy mansions in Malibu, a Michael Jackson glove replica, chateaus in France, you name it. And he used American shell companies to do it, always staying one step ahead of the law. So that money is a tremendous resource to the people of Equatorial Guinea that they'll never get back. Well, they may get back, but it's unlikely.
Steve?
Sorry, can I just come in there? Obviously, fully agree with what Mark says. I'll just put it into a perspective, if you like, that maybe the West can understand. You have, with the Panama Papers leaks, King Salman of Saudi Arabia and the President of the UAE have been exposed as using offshore accounts to fund mortgages for property in London. We have a terrible situation with property prices in this country at the moment, and these kind of deals where offshore entities come in and buy up property in London is forcing, if you like, a mass social exodus from the capital and excluding people who would have been able to live there 20 years ago and can't now. So from a Western point of view, that's another impact of this, if you like. It's things like the price of property.
Casey, I saw you raise your hand there.
I just wanted to throw in 2 points. One is that in that Obiang case where Michael Jackson memorabilia was being purchased or houses in Malibu, one of the concepts that came out was enablers. So it wasn't just bankers that were bent. It was accountants, it was real estate agents, and it was lawyers. So some of the money passed through lawyers' accounts who shielded it under attorney-client privilege. So it was not just going through normal processes, but it was lawyers that actually enabled that sort of flow to go. And yes, in London, some of the most expensive property in the entire world, 2.2 square kilometers, is owned by shell companies.
Yeah. So we have a couple of criticisms that were interesting about the way the Panama leaks, basically the Panama Papers leaks, were handled. One, interestingly enough, came from WikiLeaks. They were saying that if you censor more than 99% of the documents, you are engaged in 1% journalism by definition. And we have Privacy Blog here agrees, saying, I think Wiki is right on the mark here. You can have a searchable database of these documents and still have news stories going on together. Will, can you give us a sense of why basically the decision was not made to just make all these documents available for anyone to search online?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, I'd point out that in a few weeks' time, ICIJ will be making available data that relates to all of the 214,000 companies incorporated by Mossack Fonseca and certain people related to those, shareholders, directors, and the like. But we were 400 journalists working on this project, and as soon as we started digging, we recognized that there were legitimate private interests that should be protected. What interest does exposing the bank account routing number of an individual living in Florida really serve the public? And you can imagine with a project of this size, the last thing we want to do is to jeopardize individuals and the journalistic project itself by being reckless with what we put online.
You know, I think it's interesting you mentioned that you're not wanting to jeopardize individuals. And so then what did come out is the records here, I'll show you on my screen, of country leaders and political officials, public officials, whose records have been uncovered, really. Just scroll through. This is from the Panama Papers website, and you can see the names here who are implicated. President of Argentina, Iceland's prime minister. It really just goes down the list, and you can tab over here, and you get some of the politicians, the public officials. You have Greece, you have the DRC, you have Ecuador. Steve, you see this list, you see the names here. Did any of it surprise you?
You like the honest answer? Or,
Of course we want the honest answer.
No, none of it is unsurprising. If you work in this industry or you're involved in politics, you know full well this has been going on since the dawn of time. It's wholly unsurprising. The names are unsurprising. I think, to touch on the point about WikiLeaks and what Bill said, I think the impression I get is from WikiLeaks and a lot of people I speak to on Twitter predominantly, they're concerned that maybe corporations aren't going to get as much scrutiny as they should be, that these names aren't going to come out, that we're not going to have access to information that maybe the public should have. I understand the point about obviously individuals. We have no right to their bank account details, and if it's personal, people who aren't involved in politics or large corporations, fine. However, as a journalist myself and a member of the public, I want to know every corporation that's on that list.
So I'll just go ahead and bring up the second concern that was kind of talked about in connection to that first one. WikiLeaks also tweeted out that the US OCCRP, that is the Crime and Corruption Reporting Project that is associated with the leaks as well, can do good work, but for the US government to directly fund the Panama Papers attack on Putin seriously undermines its integrity. Now, a lot of people took that as WikiLeaks saying that the entire leak was basically a plot against Putin, and they clarified that that's not what they're claiming, but they do say that hoarding, DC organizations, and US aid money do tilt coverage. Mark, what is your sense? Do you think that any coverage has been tilted from what you've seen?
You know, I think the stories generally speak for themselves, and when you work with data and journalism, you know, there's always stories you want to be able to tell that you're looking for that you can't necessarily find. So I haven't looked at the papers. I don't know what stories are there yet to be told, haven't been told, but I can tell you in the own investigative research that we've done, you know, you often have to follow the story where it leads, no matter where it goes.
So go ahead, yeah.
I would just point out that the idea of hoarding and Washington, D.C. Isn't something I'd agree with. I mean, this has been, in addition to the largest leak of data, the largest collaboration of journalists. So ICIJ, with many of its partners, has put together 400 journalists working on this. And that includes journalists in a living room in Mali, for example, to Japan's largest newspaper, to newspapers across America, for example. So this is an exciting time, I think, to be a journalist, and technological advances allow us to share this kind of information and to publish in a way that has given us the Panama Papers impact that we've seen so far.
And you managed to keep it secret. You managed to keep it secret for so long. Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, no. I just want to touch on the Putin thing. I think what WikiLeaks are saying is it's somewhat over the top, to be honest. I don't think there's some sort of concerted campaign by the West against Putin on this. I think what there is, however, is a definite twisting, if you like, from a lot of media outlets of the story. The first thing we heard on Monday was, of course, Putin this, Russia that. His name, as far as I'm aware, wasn't even mentioned in the top. It's just a somewhat tenuous link. I think there is this slight manipulation to distract from the real major aspect of the story, which is that this is an entrenched systemic problem, offshore field, which, especially in the UK, implements us hugely. And go ahead, Kelso.
Just to say that the response by any government that would be shocked by the revelations would always come out in a defensive mode. So in Panama, we have heard that the government authorities are saying this is actually a conspiracy, perhaps from the United States, to promote their own shell company of Delaware, the state of Delaware, or other places where they can do them better than in Panama. So they want to shut down the competition, which sounds also rather far-fetched. But it's the shock and it's the defensive reaction of a government to say something like that, to call it a conspiracy.
So you mentioned defensive reaction of a government. That brings me to this point that I definitely want to make sure we get into the show, is that from the range of responses that you could see across the world to the Panama Papers, on the one end of that spectrum you had shrug shoulders, same old, same old. And the other end, you had Iceland. I want you to take a look at a clip of a report from an Al Jazeera correspondent, Lawrence Lee. He went to Reykjavik earlier this week, and he talked to one citizen there. And this is a place where, of course, we saw thousands of people take to the streets, as we mentioned at the top of the show, and kind of force their prime minister to step aside. Have a listen to what she said.
And good riddance, say people like Anna. She runs an ice cream parlour. Her new sellout is called Wintris, named after the Shell company the ousted PM and his wife established through Panama. It contains lots of lemons.
Yeah, it's very sour and bitter, and how do you say roke? How do you say?
It leaves a sour taste in the mouth.
Yeah, a bitter taste, like we all feel today.
Do you? Is that how you feel about all this?
Yeah, I'm sad and I am ashamed. Like, I'm ashamed to be an Icelander.
Why do you think Iceland was so unique here?
It's a good question. I mean, looking at what happened after the fallout of the financial crisis, where Iceland was tremendously overextended, you know, I would guess, I haven't been to Iceland, but there's a culture there that is really keen on making sure that their financial activities are above board because they've learned from the past. And so if, you know, I can see why people would be outraged.
Do you ever see that happening here on the streets of New York? I mean, we had Occupy Wall Street, didn't manage to get that far. Do you see that happening anywhere else?
I don't think we've seen it happen on the scale we saw it in Iceland. The Icelandic reporter told us that it's a country where everyone knows everyone. So in some ways it was to be expected. And as Mark says, the financial crisis has left a bad taste in the mouth of many Icelanders.
Yes, kind of lemony.
Yeah, so we have that same debate actually happening online as well. We have somebody like Talal over here who says this stuff is so rampant, who really has the means to bring an end to it? Sure, people took to the streets in Iceland, but the majority will just throw their hands in the air and go about their day. On the other hand, we got this video comment here from Andre. Take a listen to what he has to say.
I feel that the example Iceland sets for the rest of the world in the Panama Papers matter is important because it can inspire people to understand that change is possible, that the people responsible can be held to task, and that we don't have to end up in the same situation as in the economic crisis of 2007, where people felt all across the world that not enough had been done and not enough people had been made to shoulder the responsibilities.
So, Steve, do you have a sense of whether you think Iceland will actually motivate people around the world to take similar actions?
The situation in Iceland is a slightly different one. This fall from grace is quite spectacular after they famously failed the bankers after the 2008 financial crash. Whether it's replicated around the rest of the world, I'm dubious. We had our Prime Minister David Cameron admitted a few hours ago, actually, that he did benefit from his father's offshore account. After 4 different statements he's made, he's now come out and said, yes, I have. We see people on the streets demanding his resignation. I'm dubious. I think, as we keep saying, it's a kind of shrug-shouldered, let's carry on with business as usual. Iceland is a kettle of fish.
You mentioned that, Steve, and I pulled up here on my screen a report from The Independent that came out just before showtime saying what you just said, that David Cameron admitted he did have a stake in his father's offshore accounts, but said there was no wrongdoing there. Casey, I could see you nodding there when Steve was talking about Iceland, and the question from community was whether or not you could see this happening someplace else, and whether or not this makes a difference. Do you see there being any legal way out of this? Because, of course, a lot of this is not illegal per se.
Well, that's one of the maxims in anti-corruption activism, is to say that the petty criminals break the laws and the grand corrupt actually make them, to make sure that they don't have to suffer any consequences. So yeah, the goal coming out of this would be to try to have a better transparency. It would be to try to make some sort of pledge by governments that we need to know the real owner of every company in every country, to make sure that you know who you're doing business with. And when governments use taxpayers' dollars to build stadiums for the Olympics, or to pave roads, or to buy school books for children, they need to know it's not a shell company, but there's a real person, and who is it that's profiting, to make sure there's not a conflict of interest and it's not the nephew of the president.
So we have people commenting on the impact of this. We have Marianne here who says all that's going to happen here is that these people are going to get a lot better at hiding their skeletons in the closet, making it more difficult for the money to be traced. But we have an interesting question from Martin, who says, how many more Mossacks exist? I'll actually throw this to you, Will. We're already talking about a massive amount of money. Could this still be really a small portion of what could be out there if the full picture were uncovered about these types of things?
Yes, absolutely. Mossack Fonseca is an important player in the corporate services or offshore provider industry, but it's one company among many. That's a reason, for example, that may explain, for example, why we haven't seen that many high-powered or high-profile Americans in the data.
Oh, so glad you said that. That's a tweet I've gotten more than once. This is just one of them. Nafizi says, why is the name of Americans missing in the Panama Papers? There was a response. This is from a journalist, Matthew Ingram, who quotes the editor of the German publication that got this. He says, just wait for what's coming next. Is that true? Should we just wait? Will there be more?
There will be more reporting, but to my knowledge, Mossack Fonseca, for reasons unbeknownst to me, hasn't been the recipient of major American politicians or political figures as a choice to park their money.
Yeah, Will and I were actually talking about this before, and in looking at how the offshore system works, sometimes the simplest answer is the best. And there's been really great news coverage of kind of data that shows really Americans don't necessarily need to go offshore, because our own states are the sort of offshores onshore, if you will. So Delaware, Nevada, Wyoming have all been implicated in this conversation. But the reality is, you can incorporate a company in all 50 states, and in no state do you actually have to disclose the real owners of those companies.
Do you think that that's a problem?
I think it's a big problem. We've seen dozens and dozens of cases where individuals, both in the U.S. and from abroad, have set up shell companies to commit everything from human trafficking to drug dealing. Victor Boot, the notorious arms dealer, merchant of death, sold arms to everybody, including the Taliban, and used shell companies in Delaware and Texas and Florida to do it. So we need that same legislation I was mentioned earlier here in the U.S. And I was going to say, if people want to know how to act, this is a global issue that requires both global and local action. And here in the U.S., there's new legislation that would actually do just what was described, to require a very simple change. Disclose the fact that you own a business when you first create it. We want to know who we're doing business with.
That seems to make sense to me. Omar, I want to give the last word to community, because I know the Panama Papers hashtag is a big one.
We do have somebody who's thankful for the work that has been done. Poppy over here says those guys are professionals to the teeth, investigative journalism at its best.
Of course. Well, this conversation will continue. You heard it first from Will that there is more to come, so stay tuned. Of course, that hashtag is Panama Papers. We're out of time for the program, but I want to thank today's guests, Marquez, Will Fitzgibbon, Steve Topple, and Casey Kelso. We'll see you next time. Take care.